If you wanted to determine the concentration of bacteria in an original broth, you could perform a dilution series. So for example, here's the original broth. If you were to take 1/10 of a milliliter from this broth and put it onto a petri dish, that petri dish would have a 1 in 10 or a 10 to the minus 1 dilution of the original broth. You could also transfer 1 milliliter of the original broth into 9 milliliters of water and mix to create a 10 to the minus 1 dilution of the original broth. This solution could then be used to make a 10 to the minus 1 plate with 1 milliliter of solution, or a 10 to the minus 2 plate with 1/10 of a milliliter solution. 1 milliliter from the 10 to the minus 1 dilution tube could be added to 9 milliliters of water to produce a 10 to the minus 2 dilution tube, which has 1/100th the concentration of the original broth. If 1 milliliter from this tube were to be put onto a plate, it would be a 10 to the minus 2 plate. If a 1/10 of a milliliter sample of this tube were to be put onto a petri dish, it would be diluted one step further to make a 10 to the minus 3 dilution plate. If a milliliter of the 10 to the minus 2 dilution tube were then added to 9 milliliters of water, this would be a 10-fold dilution, which would then make a 10 to the minus 3 dilution tube. 1 milliliter from this put onto a plate would create a 10 to the minus 3 plate. 1/10 of a milliliter of this tube would create a 10 to the minus 4 dilution plate. 1 milliliter from the 10 to the minus 3 tube added to 9 milliliters of water would create a tube with a 10 to the minus 4 dilution. 1 milliliter from this tube onto a petri dish would create a 10 to the minus 4 dilution plate. 1/10 of a milliliter from this tube onto a petri dish would produce a 10 to the minus 5 dilution plate. A milliliter from the 10 to the minus 4 dilution tube added to 9 milliliters of water would create a 10 to the minus 5 dilution tube, and this could be used to create a 10 to the minus 5 dilution plate with 1 milliliter, or a 10 to the minus 6 dilution plate with 1/10 of a milliliter. And the dilution series could obviously be continued to create greater and greater dilutions.